The silence of deep space was not a physical thing, but in the command center of the Helios-Nine frontier tracking station, it felt heavy enough to crush bone. Deep in the outer fringes, where the light of the solar core was nothing but a pale smudge against the endless black, Helios-Nine acted as humanity's primary watchtower. It monitored the delicate threads of commerce and communication tying the outer colonies to Earth. The anomaly did not begin with a blaring warning klaxon or a violent, sudden burst of static. It began with a mathematical impossibility. Meridian Wake, a thriving, metal-ringed border colony boasting nearly 2 million souls, simply slipped. The incoming telemetry did not show a catastrophic atmospheric failure, a tectonic collapse, or a reactor meltdown. The quantum communication lines did not merely go dark in the way a broken machine would. Instead, the entire colony phase-shifted. The massive sensory arrays at Helios-Nine watched in mechanical confusion as the city's entire electromagnetic and gravitational signature slid sideways across every measurable band. It was a smooth, horrifyingly deliberate transition. It was as if the physical space the city occupied had been nudged out of alignment with the rest of reality, sliding behind a veil of physics that human minds were only just beginning to theorize. Rear Admiral Tamsin Vale was not a woman easily disturbed by the erratic, unforgiving nature of the cosmos. Known throughout the frontier fleet for a command demeanor as frigid and unyielding as zero-point energy, she slept a light, highly disciplined sleep. When the priority emergency chime woke her at precisely 2 a.m, her pulse barely elevated. She dressed in the dark, her mind already calculating fleet readiness logistics. But the data glowing on her private bedside terminal made her breath catch sharply in her throat. The deep space servers at Helios-Nine were suddenly choking on massive, corrupted data packets originating from the exact coordinates of Meridian Wake. Tamsin read the complex metadata once, then a second time to ensure her eyes were not betraying her. The servers were receiving the data now, but the packets carried a temporal stamp from exactly 36 hours in the future. By the time Tamsin reached the tactical bridge of the orbital command hub, the air was already thick with the harsh ozone scent of overworked processing mainframes. Dr. Ione Mercer, a brilliant, high-strung communications physicist who treated quantum entanglement like a native second language, was already ruthlessly dismantling the corrupted data streams. Her hands flew frantically across the holographic haptic interface, stripping away dense layers of temporal static and background cosmic radiation. Mercer managed to isolate a single, heavily degraded audio file from the chaotic flood of numbers. The voice was severely distorted, pitched down and stretched thin across the physics of whatever unnatural phenomenon had swallowed the colony. But the underlying words were unmistakable. It was a fragmented sentence, completely devoid of panic, but laced with an absolute, terrifying certainty. Do not send a diplomatic delegation. They do not want surrender. They want war. The voice belonged to Lysa Thorne, the veteran governor of Meridian Wake. Tamsin stared silently at the jagged audio waveform burning brightly on the main tactical display, the chill in the room deepening. Within the hour, the Earth Council hastily convened a secure, encrypted holographic session. The politicians and civilian scientists, desperate to maintain order, were quick to grasp at comfortable, familiar straws. They officially classified the event as a rare, unprecedented quantum disaster. The prevailing, hastily assembled theory was that the colony's massive jump gate core had suffered a critical inversion, folding the local space-time fabric in on itself and taking the city with it. Tamsin listened to their frantic, hopeful rationalizations in complete silence. Then, she pulled up the diagnostic logs for the entire outer sector and transmitted them to the Council. She pointed out a single, terrifying detail. Every single human communication relay, every navigation buoy, and every deep space network node on their side of the Meridian threshold was functioning with absolute, terrifying perfection. A gate explosion of that magnitude would have sent a violent shockwave of exotic matter rippling through the subether, frying sensitive orbital sensors for hundreds of light-years in every direction. But the surrounding void was totally pristine. The cutoff was surgically clean, lacking the chaotic mess of a true accident. The sheer horror of the situation was solidified mere moments later. A heavy, automated cargo freighter, navigating a secondary, low-priority trade route, approached the exact spatial coordinates where Meridian Wake was supposed to be anchored. Tamsin and the breathless bridge crew watched the raw telemetry feed stream in real time. The massive freighter did not collide with floating debris. It did not trigger any proximity collision alarms. It simply vanished from the tracking grid, the exact fraction of a second. Its reinforced bow crossed the invisible threshold of the colony's former orbit. The high-resolution optical sensors captured the anomaly for a fleeting millisecond, a violent, rippling distortion in the vacuum, a literal dent in the light, acting as if an invisible, gargantuan hand had pressed its thumb incredibly deep into the surface of a calm lake and held it there. Tamsin did not wait for the Earth Council to finish debating their limited jurisdiction or drafting useless exploratory protocols. Bureaucracy was a luxury reserved for a universe that made logical sense. She immediately requisitioned a small, highly classified reconnaissance fleet, brutally overriding the administrative security locks with her supreme high command clearance. She ordered Dr. Mercer to pack her diagnostic equipment and board the flagship immediately. Tamsin knew, inherently, that the physics of this event were rapidly decaying. If they waited even 12 hours for official approval, whatever unnatural boundary had been forcefully breached might seal itself forever, leaving the evidence completely out of humanity's reach. They had to look at the wound while the universe was still bleeding. The jump through the slipstream corridor was a tense, suffocatingly silent affair. The sleek reconnaissance ships cut through the higher, twisted dimensions, racing at maximum velocity toward a fixed coordinate that theoretically no longer existed. During the agonizing transit, the anomaly began to evolve. Mercer's highly sensitive instruments began catching stray, wildly fragmented radio signals, bleeding through the invisible phase barrier. They were not desperate distress calls or automated maydays. That was the most chilling, wrong part of the entire ordeal. Mercer carefully amplified the audio, projecting it for the entire command deck to hear. First came a deeply mundane, cheerful weather report predicting mild, controlled acid rain in the southern agricultural domes. Then, a standard Port Authority flight log calmly clearing a civilian transport shuttle for a routine landing. Finally, the bright, synthesized musical notes of an annual local festival song echoed softly through the rigid military speakers. Tamsin closed her eyes, listening intently to the impossible broadcast. Every single sound painted a vivid picture of a perfectly normal, productive Tuesday. It sounded exactly like the daily routine of 2 million people continuing to work and live, completely unaware that their entire world had just been violently erased from the galactic map. It was a ghost story written entirely in radio waves, whispering from a grave that had no body. Dropping out of slipstream in 3, 2, 1, the chief helmsman announced, his voice tight with restrained anxiety. The small reconnaissance fleet tore forcefully through the delicate fabric of real space, instantly stabilizing their sublight fusion engines. Tamsin stepped purposefully to the very edge of the expansive glass observation deck, her hands clasped tightly behind her back in a severe parade rest. The entire bridge crew collectively held their breath, fully expecting to see a horrific graveyard of shattered tectonic plates, a boiling, toxic atmosphere, and millions of frozen corpses floating in the dark. They saw absolutely nothing, but it was a highly specific, deeply terrifying kind of nothing. The massive expanse of space directly before them was utterly empty, completely devoid of even a microscopic speck of orbital dust or shattered glass. Yet, the advanced gravitational sensors and deep-field optical arrays were picking up a massive, undeniable spatial depression. The freezing void itself was holding a distinct shape. It was a completely empty orbit carrying the exact, undeniable volumetric shadow of Meridian Wake. It looked exactly as though the planet-sized colony had been carefully, surgically cut out of the sky by a master scalpel, leaving behind a perfectly molded, invisible casing of pure nothingness. Tamsin stared coldly into the hollow, echoing imprint of the lost colony. The grim truth settled deep into her bones with the crushing weight of depleted uranium. Meridian Wake had not been accidentally destroyed by a catastrophic reactor failure or struck by a rogue, uncharted asteroid. It had not been bombarded from orbit or aggressively glassed by enemy fire. It had been intentionally, methodically dropped out of reality entirely. And whoever possessed the godlike, terrifying capability to physically steal a planet was not bothering to hide. They had left the door wide open, waiting patiently in the dark for humanity to come looking. The tactical view screens aboard the flagship painted a picture of absolute, terrifying serenity. As the reconnaissance ships drifted deeper into the hollow imprint of the missing world, the heavy searchlights swept through the void. They did not illuminate the chaotic, jagged wreckage typical of orbital warfare. Instead, the beams caught the glint of thousands of ship fragments, drifting lazily in the microgravity. These were not the shattered, scorched remains of a desperate defense. They were pieces of civilian freighters, orbital defense monitors, and commuter shuttles, all of them bisected with absolute geometric perfection. Rear Admiral Tamsin Vale stood rigidly at the observation glass, her eyes tracing the impossible edges of the debris, where a heavy cruiser had been sliced in half. The exposed bulkheads and internal superstructures were polished mirror-smooth. There was no carbon scoring, no explosive outward flaring of depressurized hulls, and no melted slag. It looked exactly as if a godlike, invisible guillotine blade had simply descended through a higher dimension, parting hyper-titanium armor plating and fragile human engineering with the exact same lack of resistance. The silence hanging over the bridge was wrong. It was the sterile, clinical quiet of a freshly scrubbed operating theater, not the chaotic aftermath of a battlefield. There were no frozen bodies tumbling in the vacuum. There were no massive chunks of the atmospheric dome or the towering residential spires. Most disturbingly, the emergency frequencies were entirely devoid of the automated, repeating distress beacons that usually accompanied any hull breach. The scene was too clean. It was an act of violence executed with such supreme, calculated intent that it bypassed destruction entirely and moved straight into erasure. The sheer absence of carnage made the hollowed-out orbit feel profoundly more horrific than a graveyard. Dr. Ione Mercer broke the agonizing silence, her voice tight and trembling slightly as she fed new telemetry into the main hollow table. Her fingers flew across the interface, pulling up a highly specialized sensor sweep. "I am not finding any residual ash," Mercer said, her eyes fixed on the cascading data. "No vaporized organic matter. If the colony had been hit by a localized thermal weapon or an antimatter cascade, there would be a massive, lingering cloud of irradiated carbon. We have nothing. But I am reading something else." "Neutrino-negative shadows." Tamsin turned away from the glass, her expression hardening. "Explain, Doctor." Mercer expanded a complex, three-dimensional graph. It looked like a ghostly, glowing negative of a dense cityscape. Neutrinos pass through almost everything, but high concentrations of biological heat sources leave a faint, resonant footprint in the local quantum field. What we are looking at is the residual body heat of nearly 2 million people, but the thermal drop-off is instantaneous. They were not incinerated. They were pulled. All of them, simultaneously, across a highly controlled phase boundary. The implications hung heavily in the freezing air of the command deck. Millions of citizens, ripped from their morning routines, their beds, and their transit lines, dragged whole into a different layer of physics. A sharp beep from the tactical officer interrupted the grim revelation. The deep space scanners had finally locked onto a single, solid object anchored precisely at the dead center of the former planetary orbit. It was not a piece of debris. Tamsin immediately ordered a heavily armed boarding party to deploy. 10 minutes later, encased in a pitch-black, armored extravehicular activity suit, she drifted out of the airlock, propelled by brief, silent bursts of nitrogen. Mercer floated close behind her, clutching a sealed diagnostic rig. The object floating in the center of the void was a spatial anchor. It was roughly the size of a small communications tower, forged from a dark, non-reflective alloy that seemed to swallow the harsh glare of their helmet lamps. Its surface was completely smooth, devoid of any visible seams, exhaust ports, or maintenance hatches. Mercer ran her scanner over the imposing structure, shaking her head in profound confusion. The metallurgical composition and the underlying power matrix did not match a single known species in the sprawling diplomatic archives of humanity. It was entirely alien, born of an engineering philosophy that felt ancient and utterly indifferent. Tamsin approached the monolithic structure. Her military instincts screamed at her to maintain a safe distance, to blast the unknown device into dust. But the desperate need for answers overrode her tactical caution. She reached out with a heavily gauntleted hand and firmly pressed her palm against the freezing, smooth surface of the alien metal. The anchor did not violently detonate. It did not immediately broadcast a booming, authoritative ultimatum. Instead, the void around them abruptly fractured into light. A massive, hyper-realistic holographic projection bloomed into existence, spherical and perfectly scaled, enveloping the strike team in a ghost of the stolen city. But this was not a message sent by the attackers. It was a raw, unfiltered memory ripped directly from the colony itself. Tamsin found herself floating in the center of the bustling Meridian Wake Central Plaza. The projection was achingly beautiful. Sleek, silver sky buses glided smoothly overhead. Warm, amber civilian lights flickered on as the simulated evening approached. The ambient, comforting hum of public safety speakers echoed softly, blending with the phantom laughter of a crowd that was no longer there. Then, the memory violently warped. The sky above the plaza buckled, folding inward like a crushed piece of paper. The amber light stretched into infinitely long, blinding streaks of agonizing color. The geometry of the buildings twisted into impossible angles, sucked upward into a massive, ripping fold in the light itself. Just 1 second before the projection completely collapsed, the chaotic imagery snapped into a tight, focused frame. Governor Lysa Thorne appeared. She was not huddled in a bunker. She was not screaming for the frontier fleet to save her. Her face was bruised, her uniform torn, but her posture was rigid with absolute, defiant clarity. She looked directly into whatever device was recording her, her eyes burning with a chilling realization. "If anyone sees this," Thorne said, her voice steady and echoing against the dying light of her world, "they did not come to rule. They came to take people." The projection died instantly, plunging Tamsin back into the freezing, empty dark. The words slammed into the rear admiral with the force of a kinetic strike. The entire tactical paradigm shifted violently in her mind. This was not a standard Imperial conquest. When empires expanded, they bombed orbital defenses, landed massive occupation forces, planted flags, and subjugated the survivors to claim the territory and its physical resources. But the enemy that built this silent, towering anchor did not care about the physical territory of Meridian Wake. They had treated the entire colony, with its infrastructure, its knowledge, and its 2 million breathing citizens, as a harvestable, living resource. The horrific precision of the sliced ships suddenly made perfect, sickening sense. You do not burn the crop when you intend to reap it. The sheer, cold industrialization of the act multiplied the dread factor tenfold. "Admiral!" Mercer's voice crackled through the secure comms channel, pulling Tamsin back to the present. The physicist was floating near the base of the alien tower, her diagnostic rig glowing with fresh, urgent data. "I ran a deep spectrum phase analysis on the anchor's core emissions. It is not just a marker, it is a tether." Mercer transmitted the visual data directly to Tamsin's heads-up display. Faint, pulsing lines of exotic energy, invisible to standard optical sensors, were radiating outward from the dark tower. These were echo tethers, massive, vibrating strings of quantum resonance stretching away from the empty orbit, piercing directly through the local dimensional fabric. They were pointing outward, aimed squarely into an incredibly distant, completely unmapped region of the galactic void. The colony was not completely gone. It was being dragged. Tamsin floated in the suffocating silence, her hand still hovering inches from the cold, alien metal. A profound, icy rage began to crystallize within her chest, replacing the initial shock. Before the strange device could initiate whatever formal, arrogant message it was ultimately designed to deliver, Tamsin fully understood the terrifying truth of the battlefield she was standing on. She was not looking at the aftermath of a brutal, efficient massacre. She was standing at the threshold of a planetary-scale abduction, and the trail was still warm. The dark metal of the spatial anchor vibrated, sending a silent, resonant shockwave through the vacuum that rattled the teeth inside Rear Admiral Tamsin Vale's helmet. The quantum tethers Dr. Mercer had detected suddenly flared into the visible spectrum, bleeding a sickly, pale violet light across the empty orbit. Then, the true broadcast initiated. It was not a fragmented echo or a decayed memory this time. It was a live, tightly encrypted subspace transmission that punched directly through the flagship's heavy military firewalls with arrogant, terrifying ease. Every monitor on the bridge, along with the heads-up displays inside the extravehicular suits, was forcefully hijacked. A massive projection materialized in the space between the reconnaissance fleet and the anchor. It was a figure of towering, oppressive proportions, clad in layered, geometric plating that resembled a walking cathedral far more than standard combat armor. The being's actual biology was entirely obscured beneath the ornate, heavy metals of its station, but the sheer presence it projected was ancient, suffocating, and utterly devoid of empathy. This was Prefect Executor Veyra of the Kharad Ascendancy. When the entity spoke, the flagship's state-of-the-art translation software choked for a fraction of a second, struggling to process the dense, layered syntax of an empire that had been old before humanity had even discovered fire. When the translation finally locked in, the words were rendered in flawless, coldly formal English, stripped of all emotion but heavy with undeniable authority. Veyra did not open with a declaration of hostilities. He did not boast of a glorious military victory, or threaten absolute annihilation. His tone was that of a weary, indifferent administrator addressing a minor logistical error. He addressed the nascent biological collective designating itself as humanity. He stated that the sudden absence of the border colony was not an act of war, nor was it an unprovoked attack. In the rigid, ceremonial lexicon of the Kharad Ascendancy, the removal of the planetary settlement was simply classified as a levy extraction. Veyra explained that the volume of space humanity had so carelessly expanded into was not a frontier waiting to be claimed. It was a sacred corridor, an ancient transit artery belonging exclusively to the Kharad war machine. The Prefect Executor looked down at the human fleet as if studying a swarm of mildly irritating insects that had built a nest on a grand monument. He declared that humanity was far too young, too undisciplined, and too primitive to possess unfettered access to the deep transit lanes. Because of this unauthorized cosmic intrusion, a toll was now due. The demands were delivered with the casual, crushing weight of a falling mountain. To compensate the Ascendancy for the territorial violation, humanity was hereby ordered to provide 100,000 fully equipped combat personnel to serve in the vanguard of Kharad military campaigns. This conscription quota would be strictly enforced for a mandatory duration of 20 cycles. The ultimatum did not stop at forced conscription. Sci-fi seamlessly outlined the complete subjugation of the human species. The Earth Council was instructed to immediately hand over their entire master cartography of the Jump Gate network. The Frontier Fleet and all deep space expeditionary forces were to be permanently disarmed and dismantled. Finally, the human race was to peacefully accept formal integration into the Ascendancy, not as citizens, but as a heavily regulated, useful biological substrate destined for long-term strategic attrition. They were to become breeding stock for a war that had been raging for eons. Then came the ultimate, calculated insult. Sci-fi leaned forward, the sharp angles of his ceremonial armor catching the violet light of the projection. He casually clarified that the abducted colony had not been incinerated or crushed into dust. Such a waste of resources was beneath the Ascendancy. The settlement, along with its infrastructure, its data cores, and every single breathing citizen, had been carefully transitioned into the choir vault. The prefect executor described the choir vault not as a prison, but as a highly efficient, phase-locked storage network. It was an industrial processing engine designed to strip mine captive populations. Inside the vault, the inhabitants of the stolen colony were currently being meticulously dissected, not physically, but societally. Their labor was being extracted to forge weapons for their captors. Their scientific knowledge was being violently downloaded and assimilated. Their social models and psychological endurance were being constantly tested and cannibalized to optimize the endless Kharad war engine. Sci-fi made the reality of the situation perfectly, agonizingly clear. Humanity was not merely being asked to surrender their sovereignty. They were being explicitly ordered to bleed and die for the very empire that had just stolen 2 million of their people. If the Earth Council refused these generous terms, there would be no grand naval battles. There would be no sieges. The Ascendancy would simply continue to reach across the dimensional boundary, and human worlds would systematically fall into the dark. They would be ruthlessly, silently taxed by reality itself until nothing remained but empty space. The projection flickered, preparing to disconnect. Sci-fi delivered his final message with a level of arrogance so profound it bordered on the divine. "We did not come to ask how humanity wishes to live," the alien commander stated, his voice echoing with cold, absolute finality. "We came to choose what you will die for." The violet light snapped out of existence. The spatial anchor went completely dark, returning the void to its natural, freezing state. Aboard the flagship, the command bridge was transformed into a mausoleum. No one moved. No one breathed. The veteran officers, men and women who had stared down rogue warlords, mutinies, and the terrifying expanse of uncharted space, were entirely paralyzed. They were not paralyzed by cowardice, but by the sheer, unadulterated scale of the violation. The enemy had bypassed every known rule of engagement. They had redefined the very nature of conquest, turning the universe itself into a weapon of mass abduction. Tamsin cycled the airlock and stepped back onto the bridge, pulling her heavy helmet free. The metallic hiss of the depressurization was the only sound in the cavernous room. She walked deliberately toward the central holotable, her boots striking the deck plating with measured, rhythmic precision. She looked at the faces of her crew, seeing the exact reflection of the cold, hardening fury blooming in her own chest. She placed her hands flat on the edge of the tactical display. She did not slam her fists. She did not shout a fiery, defiant speech about human resilience or the glory of the fleet. She looked directly at Dr. Mercer, whose hands were still shaking over her diagnostic tablet. "I am not asking if we can win a conventional war against them," Tamsin said, her voice dropping the temperature of the room by several degrees. The words were sharp, clinical, and completely devoid of despair. "I am asking if there is a way to pull our people back." The silence shattered. The paralyzing shock evaporated, instantly replaced by a frantic, razor-focused energy. The officers turned back to their consoles, their fingers flying across the interfaces. The question fundamentally shifted the entire paradigm of their existence. War with the Kharad Ascendancy was no longer a grim possibility. It was an absolute, undeniable certainty. But as Tamsin stared out into the empty, scarred orbit, the objective crystallized into something far heavier than simple retaliation. If they merely fought to destroy the enemy, they would just be adding more corpses to an already overflowing galactic graveyard. A simple war of vengeance was a luxury they could not afford. The true mission, the only mission that mattered now, was to completely dismantle an ancient, cosmic apparatus of slavery. They were going to break the choir vault wide open. They were going to drag their people back into the light of reality, even if they had to burn down the entire ascendancy to find the door. The truth could not be contained in a vacuum. Within 48 hours of the reconnaissance mission, the heavily encrypted data logs breached the civilian networks. The information spread like a virulent contagion across the sprawling expanse of human territory. The initial reaction across Earth, Mars, and the furthest agricultural outposts was a paralyzing, cold dread. But as the full, unfiltered scope of the Kharad Ascendancy ultimatum permeated the collective consciousness, the terror rapidly crystallized into an absolute, freezing rage. The citizens realized that the alien empire did not view them as a military threat to be eradicated. The Kharad viewed humanity as raw, biological combustion material. The concept of their missing families being ground down into fuel and societal data points for an endless, alien war machine ignited a primal fury that instantly vaporized every political and social divide. Humanity was not mourning a casualty count. They were staring down the barrel of cosmic industrial enslavement. Deep beneath the heavily fortified bedrock of Geneva, the United Systems Council convened in a sealed, subterranean chamber built specifically for the end of the world. The air was stifling, thick with the scent of ozone and unfiltered panic. The supreme leaders of the human diaspora were shouting, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony of desperate survival strategies and panicked concessions. President Nadi Sorel, a woman whose entire political career was defined by her terrifying, calculated stillness, sat at the head of the long obsidian table. She allowed the shouting to peak, letting the politicians exhaust their terror before she raised a single, steady hand. The silence that instantly followed was absolute and suffocating. "We have exactly two options," Sorel stated, her voice cutting through the heavy atmosphere like a surgical blade. "We either initiate a total strategic withdrawal, pulling every frontier colony back into the Sol system, and praying our defensive grids hold long enough for us to suffocate safely in our own cradle. Or we activate the contingency." The word hung heavy in the stale air. Most of the civilian delegates exchanged confused, desperate glances. Only a few of the oldest, highest-ranking admirals rigidly straightened their spines, the color draining completely from their weathered faces. It was a ghost story whispered in the darkest, most secure corridors of naval intelligence. It was a paranoid myth passed down through generations of defense ministers. Sorel activated the central hololithic projector. For 170 years, our ancestors looked up at a galaxy that seemed entirely too quiet, too neatly arranged, and far too polite. They deduced, with grim accuracy, that a highly civilized universe is often a beautifully painted mask, hiding profound, systematic cruelty. They prepared for the inevitable day that mask would slip. The projection shifted from the standard political star map to a deeply classified, densely layered schematic. It was labeled the Night Lattice. It was not merely a hidden cache of surplus weapons or a secret bunker. It was a massive, decentralized network of shadow shipyards, subterranean dry docks, and heavily automated foundries. The Night Lattice is not just a hidden fleet, Sorel continued, her tone relentlessly even. It is an entirely separate doctrine of total war. Our standard, public military was built for border skirmishes, pirate suppression, and maintaining order. This hidden architecture was explicitly designed to fight apocalyptic threats, to execute planetary-scale rescue operations under extreme fire, and to aggressively blockade the exact phase abduction technology we just witnessed at the border. The schematic dissolved, replaced by a cascading stream of naval classifications, power outputs, and readiness statuses. Then, the final tally rendered in glowing amber light in the center of the obsidian table. 700,000. 700,000 warships of every conceivable class. There were lightning rams, built entirely around massive kinetic engines, designed to shatter enemy capital ships in a single, suicidal strike. There were phase anchors, heavily armored platforms built specifically to pin reality down and prevent dimensional folding in a combat zone. There were immense, bristling line-of-battle leviathans. And towering above them all in the registry were the morning engines, vessels so monstrously large and dense they possessed their own internal gravimetric weather systems. The chamber descended into an abyssal, ringing silence. The politicians staring at that number were fundamentally altered by it. The realization of what their species had secretly constructed in the dark, forever, stripped away their innocence. They were no longer diplomats or administrators. They were suddenly the custodians of a galaxy-ending arsenal. Sorel turned her piercing gaze directly to Rear Admiral Tamsin Vale, who stood near the edge of the projection, her posture perfectly rigid despite the crushing weight of the room. "Rear Admiral," Sorel said, her voice dropping to a conversational, yet infinitely heavy register. "If I hand you the authorization codes for 700,000 warships, I need to know your exact intention. Do you want revenge, or do you want to bring our people home?" Tamsin did not hesitate. The answer had been burned into her consciousness the moment she touched the freezing alien anchor and heard the governor's final words. "If we only seek revenge, Madam President, we will win one very violent battle. We will validate their arrogant belief that we are nothing but violent, predictable animals reacting to pain. If we use this fleet to bring our people home, we will permanently change the laws of the sky. We will completely break their economy of suffering." A sudden uproar erupted from the hawkish faction of the council. The Minister of Defense slammed his fist violently onto the table. "We must broadcast the existence of the Night Lattice immediately. We project the telemetry of this fleet across every known alien frequency. The sheer scale of it will force the Kharad Ascendancy to back down and negotiate. It is the ultimate deterrence." Tamsin stepped forward, her eyes narrowing with predatory focus. "That is the fastest way to lose this war before we fire a single shot. The Kharad Empire has survived for eons because they have mastered predictive warfare. They calculate their conquests meticulously. Right now, they believe we are a primitive, disorganized swarm, equipped with a few thousand fragile patrol boats. They are completely confident in their overwhelming superiority. We must let them continue to critically misjudge us for as long as possible. The moment we reveal the true scale of our teeth, they will adapt. They will collapse the choir vault to deny us a victory. We do not use this fleet to threaten them. We use it to blindside them." Sorel nodded slowly, the grim, undeniable logic settling over the room. The debate was over. The president reached into her podium, unlocking a physical, biometric console that had not been powered on in over a century. She entered a sequence of archaic commands, bypassing every modern digital network to send a solitary, heavily encrypted burst through the deep-crust subspace transmitters. The transmission contained only a single, heavily coded directive: "Wake the dark dockyards. This is not a rehearsal." Across the sprawling, silent expanse of human territory, the order took root. in regions explicitly marked as empty and devoid of strategic value on every public astronomical chart. The void began to tremble. In the pitch-black rings of outer gas giants, massive chunks of frozen ice and rock fractured outward. Dead moons, previously categorized as lifeless spheres of dust, cracked open along massive, artificial tectonic seams. Hollowed-out comets, drifting aimlessly for decades in the frozen dark, violently split their icy bellies, revealing miles of glowing, heavy industrial scaffolding. One by one, the dark shipyards lit up, bleeding harsh, amber light into the uncharted vacuum. Deep within these hidden vaults, fusion reactors roared to life, shaking the foundations of the dead worlds that housed them. The navigation lights of 700,000 warships flickered on in perfect, terrifying unison. From the sleekest, knife-edged interceptors to the monolithic bulk of the morning engines, the massive armada began to detach from their umbilical tethers. They drifted out of their stony graves, moving with a synchronized, chilling grace. It was not a chaotic scramble to arms. It was the deliberate, muscular flex of an ancient, terrifying organism finally opening its eyes in the dark, entirely awake and ready to hunt. The ignition of 700,000 fusion drives did not produce a triumphant roar, for the vacuum of space absorbed all sound, rendering the greatest mobilization in human history entirely silent. From the cracked crusts of dead moons and the hollowed bellies of wandering comets, the true teeth of the human race slipped into the starlight. The deployment of the Night Lattice was a masterpiece of absolute, terrifying discipline. There were no grand speeches broadcasted across the void, no ceremonial flares, and no wasted movements. First came the hundreds of thousands of Needle-class destroyers. They were built like silver lances, devoid of any aesthetic grace, designed solely to pierce enemy formations and shatter localized phase shields. Behind them drifted the Palisade-class cruisers, brutal and boxy, their hulls layered in ablative armor meant to absorb punishing kinetic strikes. Then emerged the Grave Tide-class battleships, moving with a heavy, inevitable momentum, their spinal railguns running the entire length of their massive structures. Finally, the true titans of the hidden fleet broke free from their subterranean docks. The morning engines were vessels of incomprehensible scale, measuring dozens of kilometers from bow to stern. They were so dense, so heavily armored and packed with exotic matter reactors, that their mere presence subtly warped the surrounding gravitational fields. What made this armada truly horrifying to any theoretical observer was not just its size, but its underlying design philosophy. The ships of the Kharad Ascendancy were built like floating cathedrals, dripping with ornate gold and geometric arrogance, designed to project imperial majesty and conquer inferior worlds. The human fleet, however, had been designed by generations of engineers who believed their species was permanently backed into a dark corner. There was zero imperial ego in their construction. They were built for speed, massive dispersion, and unpredictable swarm tactics. They were designed to take catastrophic damage and remain operational. Most importantly, every single vessel, from the smallest destroyer to the largest morning engine, was equipped with interlocking warp field generators. When flying in tight, coordinated formations, the human ships could weave their energy outputs together to create a massive space-time locking net, essentially pinning reality down and preventing the enemy from utilizing their cowardly dimensional folding tactics. While the physical fleet assembled in the dark, Dr. Ione Mercer and her exhausted team of quantum physicists achieved a monumental breakthrough on the flagship. For days, they had been agonizing over the bizarre, decayed radio echoes bleeding out of the empty orbit where the colony used to be. The cheerful weather reports and the rhythmic local festival music had seemed like cruel, haunting ghosts. But Mercer realized they were not random echoes. The citizens of the abducted world had known they were being taken. In the frantic moments before their reality was completely inverted, The colonies' automated defense intelligences and civilian technicians had intentionally embedded complex telemetry into their standard public broadcasts. Mercer isolated the tempo of the festival music and the specific barometric numbers in the weather predictions. When translated through a standard navigational matrix, the mundane data unraveled into a highly precise string of spatial coordinates. The people of the lost colony had left a breadcrumb trail in the dark. They had transmitted the exact dimensional location of the choir vault so that if humanity ever found a way to follow, they would know exactly where to strike. Armed with this critical intelligence, Rear Admiral Tamsin Vale gathered her senior commanders around the central holotable. She categorically rejected the idea of a frontal, glorious assault on the Kharad capital. Striking the heart of the alien empire would merely trigger a massive, entrenched defensive war. Instead, she outlined a brutal, systematic campaign of hamstringing the enemy. The strategy was to bypass the heavy Imperial fleets entirely and strike the Ascendancy's logistical tendons. The human armada would target the isolated phase anchor stations, the deep space navigation relays, and the massive dimensional bending centers that were actively keeping the stolen colony outside of normal reality. To execute this, the fleet of 700,000 ships was meticulously divided into dozens of overlapping waves. Each wave was assigned a dual mandate: surgical military destruction and hyper-delicate rescue operations. Tamsin made it agonizingly clear that simply destroying the Kharad containment facilities was not an option. If they shattered the alien phase technology while the colony was still trapped in the threshold, the resulting dimensional snapback could instantly tear millions of people down to their component atoms. They had to hold the enemy off, stabilize the ruptured spacetime, and carefully reel the colony back into the physical universe. It was a military operation, operating with the delicate precision of open-heart surgery. Back within the safe borders of the core systems, the revelation of the Night Lattice had fundamentally shifted the psychological state of the human public. The sheer, overwhelming terror of the alien ultimatum was replaced by a grim, unified resolve. When the civilian governments officially acknowledged the existence of the hidden armada, there were no riots in the streets. There was no widespread panic. Instead, the deep space communication buoys connecting the core worlds to the staging grounds were suddenly flooded with data. Citizens from every colony, every orbital habitat, and every terrestrial city began transmitting personal files directly to the fleet's secure servers. They sent millions of audio recordings, family photographs, digital diaries, and the names of every single missing person from the abducted world. The fleet's databanks overflowed with the weight of human memory. Attached to every file was a variation of the same desperate plea: bring them home if you still can. The soldiers and pilots of the hidden armada downloaded these files directly into their cockpit displays and targeting consoles, binding the sterile mechanics of war to the deepest, most profound core of human emotion. Meanwhile, light years across the galaxy, the deep space augurs of the Kharad Ascendancy registered a sudden, massive spike in exotic particle emissions along the human border. The alien intelligence analysts presented the data to their superiors, noting the strange, coordinated energy signatures. However, an empire that had ruled unopposed for eons was structurally incapable of recognizing a true existential threat from a species they considered livestock. The Kharad commanders arrogantly dismissed the readings as desperate, uncoordinated engine flares. Their predictive algorithms, fed entirely on their own supreme confidence, concluded that humanity had frantically scraped together a pathetic defensive line of perhaps 30,000 or 40,000 obsolete patrol ships. Their absolute pride formed an impenetrable blindfold, completely preventing them from reading the true, apocalyptic scale of the storm gathering on their horizon. Standing on the bustling command deck of her heavy cruiser, Tamsin Vale watched the final readiness reports turn green across her tactical displays. She keyed the master communication channel, opening a line to every single vessel in the vast armada. She did not deliver a roaring speech about vengeance. Instead, she issued a single administrative command. She officially struck the flagship's original shipyard designation from the Naval Registry. She ordered the transponders updated and broadcast the new name across all human and alien frequencies. The flagship was now the United Systems ship Meridian Wake. It was a stark, undeniable message to every sailor operating in the dark. This monumental campaign was not the first grand conquest of a rising human empire. It was the first, terrifying answer, delivered on behalf of the people who had been violently dragged from the sky. When the order to jump was finally given, the armada did not move like a traditional military parade. They did not form neat, ceremonial lines or rely on flashy, aggressive posturing. The fleet of 700,000 warships slipped into the dimensional corridor in a synchronized, overlapping maneuver that resembled a perfectly ordered, inescapable natural disaster. They moved with a chilling, mechanical fluidity, bound together by an unbreakable organizational will. Any entity watching them tear through the fabric of space would instantly understand the true meaning of the word dangerous. It was not merely about having the largest guns or the thickest armor. True danger was a species pushed to the absolute brink, deciding to organize its rage into a flawless, unstoppable machine. The Kharad Ascendancy anticipated a grand, sweeping naval duel. They marshaled their vanguard armada at the Veyra Span, a brilliantly illuminated star cluster that served as the outer gate to their imperial core. They expected humanity to charge in with roaring engines and wounded pride, desperate to prove their worth on a traditional, two-dimensional plane of honor. The Ascendancy commanders arranged their golden leviathans in perfect, overlapping defensive grids, waiting patiently for the primitive biologicals to break themselves against an unbreakable wall of superior plasma artillery. Rear Admiral Tamsin Vale possessed exactly zero interest in participating in their imperial theater. When the human fleet translated into normal space, they did not announce their arrival with a unified, localized entry point. They did not form a predictable battle line. Instead, tens of thousands of Needle-class destroyers materialized in a chaotic, perfectly calculated shotgun spread across a volume of space, roughly 3 light hours wide. Their targets were not the towering Kharad capital ships. They aimed exclusively for the intricate network of subspace relays, targeting buoys, and phase coordination nodes that tied the alien armada together into a single, cohesive fighting force. Before the Kharad admirals could even order their gunners to track the incoming contacts, human phase anchor platforms engaged. They drove heavy, invisible spikes into the local dimensional fabric, locking down the exact frequencies the Ascendancy used to communicate. The Kharad network shattered instantly. Humanity did not engage in a war of attrition or a contest of raw tonnage on their first strike. They waged a war of supreme disorientation. By blinding the enemy combat web, Tamsin reduced a highly synchronized Imperial vanguard into thousands of isolated, deaf islands. The Kharad targeting algorithms began to hallucinate wildly. Alien dreadnoughts rotated their massive batteries and fired catastrophic energy volleys at human signatures that were already gone, engaging empty space based on telemetry that was 5 minutes old. In the unforgiving, hyper-lethal arithmetic of orbital combat, 5 minutes of latency was a guaranteed death sentence. Friendly fire ripped through the Kharad lines as their automated defense turrets panicked, mistaking the electronic ghosts of human ships for point-blank boarding rams. The Ascendancy had the superior firepower, but they had completely lost the ability to see the war as a singular, unified shape. They were punching blindly in the dark. Aboard the human flagship, Dr. Ione Mercer bypassed the chaotic tactical feeds and plunged her decryption software directly into the severed data streams of the dying Kharad relays. She was not looking for troop movements. She was looking for the architectural logic of the Empire. The raw, logistical data flowing from the Imperial core painted a terrifying, systemic truth. The Ascendancy did not conquer territory for physical expansion or mineral wealth. They had constructed a sprawling, parasitic economy built entirely around the phase vaults. They abducted dynamic, young civilizations, dragging them into the dark to strip mine their collective memories, their industrial innovations, and their cognitive flexibility. The Kharad Empire was ancient, but it was culturally and technologically stagnant. They were rotting from the inside out, completely incapable of original thought or creative problem-solving. That was exactly why their commander had demanded war. He did not want to crush a minor border rebellion. He desperately needed a fresh, unpredictable opponent to feed into his grinding, starving war machine. Humanity was not meant to be a simple victim. They were meant to be the next battery to keep a dying empire breathing for another millennium. As the human electronic warfare completely dismantled the Kharad defense grid, secondary scanners aboard the human cruisers picked up anomalous readings near the edge of the Veyra cluster. Two massive fortified logistics stations were not housing munitions or fuel. They were radiating the thermal signatures of tens of thousands of biological captives from dozens of different subjugated alien species, all waiting to be processed and shipped into the phase vaults. Tamsin did not hesitate to alter the battle plan, introducing a variable the alien predictive models could never have anticipated. She issued a fleet-wide command that fundamentally broke every known rule of Kharad engagement. A massive contingent of the human vanguard completely stopped firing. They deliberately powered down their primary offensive railguns to divert maximum energy to their forward deflector shields. The heavy cruisers formed a massive, overlapping physical wall, taking punishing direct hits from the confused Kharad defenders to carve out a clean, heavily armored rescue corridor. Heavily armored human boarding transports punched through the crossfire and docked with the slave stations. Across the sprawling battlefield, mercenary factions and conscripted vassal fleets serving the Ascendancy watched the monitors in absolute, paralyzed shock. They were witnessing a sovereign military force willingly absorb massive tactical damage and sacrifice their operational momentum simply to open a door for strangers. It was an act of profound, weaponized empathy that completely defied the grim, Darwinian logic of the universe they knew. To the observing galaxy, this was a display of power far more terrifying than a superweapon. It was the power of restraint. In the chaos of the rescue operation, human Marines secured a high-value prisoner from one of the relay outposts. Var Issen was a senior archivist and historian for the Ascendancy, tasked with recording the levy extraction for the Imperial Library. Sitting in a cold, sterile interrogation cell aboard a human destroyer, watching his supposedly invincible armada shoot itself to pieces on the tactical monitors, the archivist broke completely. He confessed, his voice trembling, that the sacred corridor mentioned by his supreme commander was nothing but a convenient political myth. The Kharad leadership used it to legally justify their horrific harvest cycles to their own civilian populace, wrapping a campaign of cosmic abduction in the language of holy law. But the human colony was not selected at random or for being in the wrong place. The settlement was specifically targeted for assassination. Human physicists stationed there had been mere weeks away from successfully reverse engineering the fundamental principles of dimensional phase locking. The Kharad did not just steal a workforce. They violently suppressed a technological awakening that could have unraveled their monopoly on reality itself. The Battle of Veyra Span ended not with the total annihilation of the enemy fleet, but with its complete structural humiliation. The surviving Kharad ships, blind, battered by their own panic, and stripped of their command hierarchy, executed desperate, uncoordinated tactical retreats into the deeper sectors. But the true victory for humanity was not measured in shattered hulls or captured territory. It was measured in the intercepted communications chatter echoing across the entire sector. The vassal species, the conscripted alien auxiliary fleets, and the newly liberated prisoners were all broadcasting the same impossible truth into the void. They had seen the mask ripped from the face of their ancient oppressors. The myth of Kharad invincibility was bleeding out in the vacuum, completely exposed by a species that refused to play by the established rules of imperial warfare. Yet, as Tamsin Vale surveyed the glowing debris field from the bridge of her flagship, her expression remained entirely devoid of triumph. They had proven they could outthink and outmaneuver the imperial vanguard. They had exposed the rotting, parasitic heart of the enemy economy to the entire galaxy. But winning the conventional war was merely treating a symptom. Tamsin knew, with agonizing, icy clarity, that no matter how many golden dreadnoughts they reduced to slag, it would not ultimately matter. Until they found a way to completely shatter the core technology, holding the dimensional boundary closed, the lost colony would remain a ghost trapped behind the glass, an untouchable shadow, forever suspended in the dark. The heavily decrypted architectural schematics of the choir vault finally rendered on the main tactical holotable, and the sheer, horrifying complexity of it instantly killed any remaining momentum on the command deck. Dr. Ione Mercer manipulated the glowing blue projections, her face pale under the harsh synthetic lights. The alien prison was not a single, isolated physical structure. It was a suffocatingly dense labyrinth of compressed dimensional folds. Meridian Wake was buried deep within its center, but it was not alone. The human colony was violently sandwiched between dozens of other ancient, stolen worlds belonging to species that had been erased from the galactic record centuries ago. They were all woven together in a fragile, agonizingly delicate web of phase energy. Mercer made the grim reality undeniable. If the human fleet simply launched a brute force kinetic bombardment against the central anchor holding the vault together, the resulting spatial implosion would instantly crush every single trapped population into subatomic dust. Total retaliation was a mathematically simple equation. Rescue, however, was a terrifyingly fragile tightrope walk. This revelation fractured the unified front of the human command structure. A bitter, venomous ideological schism rapidly erupted across the encrypted communication channels, connecting the Vanguard to the United Systems Council back on Earth. A highly vocal faction of deep space commanders and hawkish politicians demanded the immediate, total mobilization of all 700,000 warships directly to the Kharad capital. They argued that possessing an apocalyptic armada morally obligated them to deliver a killing blow. They wanted to warp into the imperial atmosphere and burn the alien homeworld until the crust turned to blackened glass, citing it as the only language a parasitic empire would understand. Rear Admiral Tamsin Vale stood at the center of the storm, absorbing the crushing pressure from all sides. Her private communication channels were overflowing with desperate, agonizing pleas from the families of the Meridian Wake victims. They demanded a visible, bloody conclusion. They wanted the Ascendancy to burn for what it had taken. Simultaneously, the leaders of the newly liberated alien vassal species were watching humanity with terrified, calculating eyes. They were waiting to see if their supposed saviors were truly different, or if humanity was simply a younger, angrier tyrant, preparing to claim the vacant throne of the galaxy. The ideological pressure cooker violently exploded on the far edge of the combat zone. Commodore Cale Rourke, a deeply respected outerline commander whose own sister resided on Meridian Wake, completely severed his tactical data link with the flagship. Driven by a volatile, blinding mixture of grief and fury, he rallied a splinter wing of 40 heavy cruisers and launched an unauthorized, aggressive orbital strike against a massive Kharad industrial cluster. He broadcast his justification on an open frequency, calling it a necessary exaction of blood debt. The heavy, depleted uranium munitions slammed into the alien foundries, completely obliterating the sprawling factories. But the sheer kinetic violence of the bombardment triggered a massive, unintended sympathetic resonance in the local phase grid. Aboard the United Systems ship Meridian Wake, the emergency proximity alarms shrieked with deafening intensity. Mercer watched in absolute horror as the structural telemetry of the choir vault violently destabilized. Rourke's reckless demand for immediate vengeance sent a spatial shockwave directly down the alien tethers. The temporal shadow of the human colony flickered violently on the monitors, drifting mere fractions of a millimeter away from total dimensional collapse. He had almost killed the very people he set out to avenge. Tamsin did not issue a warning. She did not open a channel to negotiate or demand a stand-down. She bypassed the standard command hierarchy entirely, directly accessing the central mainframe of Rourke's cruiser using her supreme command overrides. She immediately locked out his helm, disabled his weapon batteries, and paralyzed his navigation drives. Over a harsh, fleet-wide broadcast, she formally stripped the Commodore of his rank and ordered his own Marine detachment to arrest him on his own bridge. It was a brutally dangerous, highly controversial decision. It threatened to completely shatter the fragile morale of an armada composed largely of untested crews operating under apocalyptic stress. Muted anger rippled through the fleet, whispering that their commander was punishing her own people while the enemy remained unbowed. But Tamsin enforced the arrest with chilling stoicism to carve a permanent, undeniable line in the cosmic sand. She would not allow human grief to transform them into a mirror image of the monsters they were fighting. Before the resentment could fester into outright mutiny, President Nadi Sorel intervened. She bypassed the frantic debates of the council chamber and transmitted a secure, system-wide holographic address directly to the command deck of every single warship in the fleet. Sorel did not yell, nor did she attempt to pacify them with hollow political rhetoric. Her voice was calm, yet it carried the absolute, unyielding gravity of human history. True power is not measured by the number of worlds we are capable of reducing to ash, the president stated, her gaze seemingly locking with every individual sailor across the void. True power is possessing the absolute, undeniable capability to burn this galaxy to the ground, and making the conscious, excruciatingly difficult choice to keep your weapons holstered. The sheer moral weight of that restraint sent a profound shockwave through the galactic underbelly. The heavily encrypted diplomatic channels aboard the flagship suddenly began to light up. Desperate, whispered communications poured in from countless subjugated alien races residing deep within Kharad territory. They were not opening back channels simply because they saw humanity winning tactical engagements. They were reaching out because, for the first time in their collective memories, they were witnessing a supreme military superpower actively bind itself to a strict, ethical framework. Humanity was proving it could hold the sword of a god without instantly swinging it. In the quiet aftermath of the political storm, Dr. Mercer burst onto the flagship's command deck, her eyes wide with a mixture of absolute terror and breathtaking awe. She had spent the last 48 hours synthesizing the dimensional feedback from Rourke's disastrous bombardment, and she had discovered an anomaly. She outlined a tactical maneuver so mathematically complex and physically demanding that it bordered on absolute madness. If every single one of their 700,000 warships was positioned at perfectly calculated, highly specific intervals around the Choir Vault nexus, the Armada itself could fundamentally change its purpose. By perfectly synchronizing the massive outputs of their individual warp field generators, the entire human fleet could act as a colossal, physical tuning fork. They could create a staggering resonance array capable of matching the exact vibrational frequency of the alien phase locks. Mercer explained that they did not need to break the vault open with artillery. They could theoretically use the entire fleet to manually peel back the dimensional boundary, gently dragging Meridian Wake back into reality. But the resonance field would be so unbelievably expansive that it possessed the potential to grab hold of the dozens of other ancient, forgotten colonies trapped alongside them. If executed flawlessly, they could pull everyone back simultaneously. The tactical cost of this maneuver, however, was borderline suicidal. To maintain the highly volatile resonance lattice, the entire human fleet would be forced to completely drop their defensive deflector shields and hold absolutely stationary positions in open space. They would become entirely vulnerable paralyzed targets for any Kharad counterattack. Tamsin stared at the intricate holographic projection of the proposed resonance array, the crushing weight of the final decision settling heavily onto her shoulders. The paradigm of the entire war had irrevocably shifted. The ultimate test facing humanity was no longer a simple question of how to defeat the Kharad Ascendancy in a battle of attrition. The final, looming confrontation was fundamentally about whether they possessed the iron discipline and the raw courage to secure a victory without betraying the very souls they had launched the armada to save. The silence within the archive basilica was not empty. It was pressurized by the weight of millions of stolen histories. Deep beneath the fortified crust of the Kharad Ascendancy's capital world, the infiltration team moved like phantoms through towering, monolithic aisles of data storage. Special Operative Junia Voss led the formation. She was a shadow rendered in tactical polymer, her suppressed pulse rifle tracking every blind corner with mechanical precision. She communicated only in sharp, abbreviated hand signals, her eyes scanning the dim, violet-lit corridors for automated sentinels. Close behind her, Dr. Ione Mercer carried a heavy, specialized decryption rig, her breath shallow and tight in her chest. Bringing up the rear was Var Issen. The captive Kharad archivist trembled violently beneath his heavy robes, terrified not only of the Imperial Guards, but of the monumental heresy he was actively committing against his own civilization. They had slipped past the planetary defense grid using a stolen, heavily modified diplomatic cutter, burning its engines out to match a specific, authorized re-entry trajectory. Now, standing in the absolute center of the enemy empire, the atmosphere felt less like a military command center and more like a decaying cathedral built entirely upon a foundation of cosmic theft. Var guided them past the superficial, propagandistic historical records meant for public consumption. He utilized his high-ranking biometric clearances to open a massive, sealed vault door that groaned with the friction of centuries of disuse. Inside lay the Genesis cores, the true, unredacted chronicles of the Kharad species. Ione instantly interfaced her rig with the ancient, crystalline terminals. As the raw data flooded her screens, the terrifying myth of the invincible empire completely unraveled. The Kharad Ascendancy had not been born from a position of supreme, divine strength. The records depicted a pathetic, desperate origin. Eons ago, the Kharad were a dying race, trapped on a decaying world orbiting a collapsing star, their own genome unraveling from generations of heavy radiation exposure. Facing absolute extinction, their ancestors did not look to the stars with wonder. They looked with bottomless, starving envy. They invented the phase vault technology not as a weapon of conquest, but as a parasitic survival mechanism. They survived by forcibly dragging younger, vibrant societies into the dark, leeching their genetic diversity, their industrial labor, and their untainted resources. The Empire was a cosmic vampire. Veyra was not an irrational, bloodthirsty madman. He was an apex administrator managing a rotting, stagnant corpse. He knew the Ascendancy was starving, entirely dependent on fresh infusions of stolen reality to maintain its failing infrastructure. A massive, theatrical victory over the human armada was absolutely necessary. He needed to violently subjugate humanity to replenish his war engine. But more importantly, he needed to re-establish a reign of absolute terror to keep the countless vassal species paralyzed by fear. If the illusion of Kharad invincibility shattered, the Empire would be torn apart from the inside by a billion vengeful slaves. But as Ione dug deeper into the heavily restricted files regarding the recent border incursions, she uncovered the most devastating truth of all. She found the decrypted, stolen research logs belonging to her own colleagues back on Meridian Wake. The human physicists stationed on the colony had not merely been studying ambient dimensional radiation. They had accidentally mapped the exact quantum frequency required to permanently break the phase locks. the human scientist had unknowingly written the master key capable of opening the entire choir vault. If that formula had reached Earth, humanity could have liberated not just their own people, but countless alien civilizations that had been erased from the galactic timeline for centuries. The sudden, brutal extraction of Meridian Wake suddenly made terrifying sense. It was never a random tax collection. It was a desperate, panicked assassination of an idea. The Kharad military had moved with absurd speed to silence a discovery that would instantly end their entire model of parasitic domination. A deep, bone-rattling vibration suddenly shuddered through the heavy stone floor of the basilica. The crystalline terminals around them flared an angry, blinding crimson. Voss instantly raised her weapon, aiming down the long corridor, her voice a sharp hiss over the local comms. "We have tripped a deep system ward. We have company." Varison stared at the crimson light, his eyes wide with absolute, unadulterated horror. "It is not the guards," the archivist whispered, his voice cracking. "Veyra knows you are here. He knows the human fleet is preparing a resonance maneuver. He has activated the crown furnace." Ione demanded an explanation, her fingers flying across her keyboard to download the final terabytes of data. Var explained that the crown furnace was the ultimate, scorched earth failsafe of the Kharad emperors. It was a massive, ceremonial phase weapon designed to flood the entire choir vault with chaotic, hyper-compressed thermal energy. It would literally burn the dimensional pocket down to subatomic ash. Veyra was choosing to completely incinerate Meridian Wake, along with millions of other captive aliens, to permanently destroy the evidence of his empire's crimes. He would rather rule over a galaxy of ashes than allow humanity to expose the Ascendancy as a dying parasite. Ione slammed her hand onto the transmission key, firing a highly compressed, heavily shielded data burst directly through the planet's crust, aimed squarely at the human vanguard waiting light-years away. Aboard the United Systems ship Meridian Wake, Rear Admiral Tamsin Vale received the decrypted package. As she read the intelligence, the cold, methodical battle plan she had crafted violently disintegrated. The terrifying reality crashed down upon the command deck. There was no more time for careful, surgical positioning. There was no time to slowly tune the 700,000 warships into a perfect resonance array. The crown furnace was already building its thermal charge. If they waited even 30 more minutes to align the fleet perfectly, they would drag nothing but a cloud of radioactive dust back into reality. The final, apocalyptic confrontation had to begin right this exact second. Back in the suffocating depths of the basilica, Voss grabbed Ione by the harness, pulling her away from the terminal. "We need to move to the extraction point now," the operative barked, laying down a volley of suppressive fire down the corridor as heavy, armored footsteps began to echo in the dark. But Varison did not follow them. The archivist turned away from the extraction route and locked himself inside the primary broadcast spire control room, slamming his hand onto the heavy magnetic seal. He looked at Ione through the thick, transparent armor-glass. A strange, profound peace settling over his terrified features. He was a man who had spent his entire life cataloging the lies of his gods, and he had finally decided to burn the library down. Var bypassed the Imperial sensors and tapped directly into the Ascendancy's massive, interstellar communication network. He did not send a plea for help. He took the unredacted Genesis cores, the absolute proof of the Kharad's parasitic, cowardly origins, and broadcast them on every single open frequency across the galaxy. He sent the truth to the subjugated vassal fleets, to the slave labor camps, and to the conscripted alien mercenaries holding the Imperial front lines. He exposed the fact that the golden throne of the Ascendancy was built entirely upon the stolen futures of innocent worlds. The infiltration team fled into the dark conduits as the Basilica's security forces swarmed the archive, leaving Varison to face the wrath of a crumbling empire. The pressure compressing the human fleet reached a critical, agonizing singularity. The truth was out in the void. The exact coordinates of the prison were locked into the navigation computers. But time, the most vital resource in the universe, had entirely evaporated. Tamsin stared at the tactical display, knowing she had to throw her entire armada into a chaotic, desperate dive into the fire. It was a monumental gamble where a single, microscopic miscalculation would instantly turn the greatest rescue mission in history into a meaningless, silent grave. The choir vault nexus tore across the visual spectrum like a shattered mirror suspended in the freezing void. It was an impossible expanse of space where thousands of compressed dimensional folds violently overlapped, refracting the distant starlight into jagged, agonizing angles. Into this chaotic, deeply unstable arena, the human armada translated from the slipstream, bringing with them a rapidly expanding coalition of newly emboldened alien defectors. Prefect Executor Veyra observed the staggering mass of 700,000 hostile contacts flooding his command displays. Operating strictly on the rigid, archaic military doctrines that had sustained his empire for eons, he made a massive, fatal assumption. He believed this unparalleled gathering of ships was preparing to deliver a final, blunt force decapitation strike against the Imperial Center. In response, he ordered his elite Royal Guard, a terrifying wall of heavily gilded, monolithic dreadnoughts, to form an impenetrable blockade. They locked their primary plasma batteries forward, cementing a traditional defensive front line and bracing for a glorious, suicidal charge. That deeply ingrained Imperial arrogance was exactly the miscalculation Rear Admiral Tamsin Vale needed. Humanity did not charge. Instead, the vast armada executed a breathtakingly complex, synchronized drift. The 700,000 warships slid into highly specific, mathematically perfect coordinates, completely ignoring the enemy firing lines. They were not forming a spearhead. They were constructing the resurrection lattice. It was a staggering feat of orbital engineering, a colossal, physical arm made of starships designed to pry the dimensional jaws open and hold them there without crushing the fragile worlds trapped inside. The gargantuan morning engines powered down their offensive drives and engaged their heavy gravity anchors, effectively nailing the local fabric of reality to the floor. Through the localized stability they created, the agile needle destroyers darted like silver thread, using their pinpoint phase emitters to literally sew the violently tearing spatial rifts together. To protect this agonizingly delicate operation, the massive Gravetide battleships advanced, forming a brutal, interlocking firewall of ablative armor and raw kinetic shielding. They stood their ground, absorbing the frantic, blistering counterattack from the Imperial Guard as the alien commanders finally realized the human fleet was not trying to kill them, but trying to pick the lock on their greatest vault. Realizing the structural integrity of the phase prison was failing under the immense resonance of the lattice, Veyra succumbed to absolute, destructive spite. He bypassed all standard Imperial safety protocols and transmitted the supreme override command to initiate the crown furnace prematurely. If he could not break the human armada in open combat, he would simply incinerate the prize they were fighting for. He was entirely willing to burn the human colony, along with dozens of his own stolen worlds, down to subatomic ash, just to deny humanity a moral and historical triumph. As the catastrophic thermal warnings began screaming across the human command deck, Tamsin unleashed the payload her infiltration team had sacrificed everything to secure. She broadcast the unredacted historical records across every open combat frequency in the sector. She paired the horrific truth of the Empire's parasitic origins with a localized, real-time list of every single world currently being digested by the Vault, formally declaring them taxed by reality. The sheer, undeniable proof slammed into the Kharad auxiliary forces like a kinetic strike. The vast lines of conscripted vassal fleets shuddered. For several agonizing moments, the battlefield fell into a strange, localized paralysis. Then, a heavy cruiser belonging to an avian vassal species deliberately powered down its targeting lasers and drifted out of formation. Dozens more followed. Entire wings of alien mercenaries simply turned their thrusters and abandoned the sector. Others, pushed beyond the brink by centuries of hidden subjugation and fueled by the sudden revelation of their stolen histories, violently rotated their heavy cannons and fired directly into the vulnerable flanks of the Kharad Royal Guard. The Imperial front line collapsed into a vicious, chaotic civil war. Deep within the human flagship, Dr. Ione Mercer pushed the resonance core of the Resurrection Lattice to its absolute maximum threshold. Sweat stung her eyes as she manually aligned the overlapping warp fields of the vast fleet. Then, a sound cut through the heavy static of her earpiece. It was not the ambient noise of a dead city or a fragmented distress beacon. It was a live, synchronized audio feed piercing directly through the phase barrier. She heard the people of the lost colony. They were not screaming in terror. They were not begging the fleet for salvation. Millions of voices were chanting together in a steady, unified rhythm, counting out the precise dimensional frequency beat by agonizing beat. The citizens inside the vault were actively helping humanity pull the rope from the other side of the abyss. The raw, unbroken spirit of that rhythmic count hit the command deck harder than any explosive shockwave. Driven by the coordinated pulse of the captive world, the lattice finally bit deep into the dimensional threshold. The dark void at the center of the battlefield suddenly ripped wide open. The entire combat zone reached the apex of utter chaos as a colossal, pale blue specter materialized amidst the furious crossfire. It was a massive section of the stolen colony. Its towering atmospheric domes and sprawling residential grids flickering wildly like a faulty projection. The ghost city solidified for a single, breathtaking second, casting long, physical shadows across the armored hulls of the human warships, before violently blurring out of focus again. The visual was an agonizing torture. The stolen world was right there, close enough to touch, yet completely intangible, threatening to slip through their fingers and disappear into the dark with every passing second. The tactical situation abruptly compressed into a terrifying singularity. The crown furnace was mere minutes away from critical detonation, radiating a sickly, boiling red light that was actively searing the edges of the phase rifts. The colony had revealed its shape, but had not yet anchored back into real space. The remaining Kharad Royal Guard, completely unhinged by the vassal mutinies and the impending collapse of their reality, broke all defensive protocols and initiated a desperate, suicidal ramming charge against the buckling human firewall. Tamsin stood at the absolute precipice of the war. She had a narrow, fleeting window to break the lattice formation, redirect the morning engines, and deliver a clean, killing blow to Sakver's command dreadnought. It would instantly shatter the Imperial command structure and guarantee a military victory. But doing so would instantly collapse the delicate rescue corridor. She had to make the ultimate, excruciating choice between executing the tyrant who started the fire or keeping her fleet completely paralyzed under heavy bombardment to hold the door open for her people. The tactical holotable on the bridge of the flagship presented Rear Admiral Tamsin Vale with a brutally simple arithmetic of war. The Kharad Supreme Command dreadnought had overextended. Its deflector shields were critically depleted from the chaotic vassal uprising. Tamsin had a clean, unobstructed firing solution. She could order her reserve heavy cruisers to break formation and vaporize Sakver in a single, blinding instant. It would permanently decapitate the enemy leadership and secure a textbook military triumph. But Tamsin looked at the agonizingly fragile, flickering blue ghost of the human colony suspended in the dimensional rift. If the human fleet broke their carefully calibrated resonance positions to launch an offensive strike, the physical net holding the phase vault open would instantly collapse. Tamsin refused the easy kill. She gripped the edge of the command console and broadcast her final order across the human armada. They were to hold the Resurrection Lattice at all costs. They would accept the punishing, point-blank fire from the Kharad Royal Guard entirely sacrificing their tactical advantage to prioritize dragging their people back from the void. The cost of that decision was paid in immediate, blinding violence. The forward human battleships absorbed cataclysmic plasma volleys, their ablative armor melting into glowing slag. Frigates and destroyers ruptured silently in the dark, their crews willingly trading their lives to maintain the structural integrity of the resonance array. But it was precisely this agonizing choice to bleed for salvation, rather than strike for vengeance, that fundamentally broke the psychological back of the enemy. The rebelling Kharad vassal fleets watched the human warships willingly burn to keep the rescue corridor open. The profound, terrifying power of that sacrifice shattered whatever lingering fear the subjugated aliens held for their former masters. The alien auxiliary armadas completely stopped their chaotic retreat. They violently reversed their courses, driving their own heavily damaged cruisers directly into the line of fire. They formed a physical, desperate barricade of alien metal between the enraged Imperial Guard and the vulnerable human rescue operation. As the Allied alien ships absorbed the Imperial fury, a sudden, crystal-clear transmission punched through the collapsing dimensional static. It was not a fragmented echo. It was a direct, localized broadcast from within the deepest core of the choir vault. Governor Lysa Thorne appeared on the main displays of the human flagship, her uniform stained and her face gaunt, but her eyes burning with unbroken defiance. She revealed that the 2 million citizens of the abducted world had not simply waited in the dark to be saved. For weeks, civilian engineers and local defense technicians had been meticulously, quietly sabotaging the primary phase navigational rhythms of the alien prison from the inside. They had been slowly cracking the lock, waiting patiently for the exact moment someone on the outside arrived to push the door open. Dr. Ione Mercer did not waste a single second. She captured the highly specific, erratic tempo of the colony's internal sabotage and fed it directly into the master resonance core of the human fleet. She synchronized the massive energy output of all 700,000 warships perfectly with the rhythmic rebellion beating inside the vault. In that profound instant, the greatest armada humanity had ever assembled ceased to be a weapon of war. It transformed entirely into a gargantuan, perfectly tuned engine of salvation. The dimensional rift screamed as the fabric of reality violently snapped back into its natural alignment. Meridian Wake crashed back into the physical universe. The sheer kinetic shockwave of its return displaced millions of tons of orbital dust. The colony was battered. Entire structural grids were dark, and highly localized temporal distortions caused certain atmospheric domes to cycle through days and nights in a matter of minutes. But the world was real. It was undeniably, physically present. And it did not return alone, drawn by the massive gravitational wake of the human colony. Dozens of other ancient, long-forgotten planetary fragments poured out of the collapsing vault. Bizarre, beautiful alien cityscapes, belonging to species completely erased from the galactic history books, solidified in the freezing vacuum, finally liberated from centuries of stagnant purgatory. High above the newly crowded orbit, aboard his heavily damaged dreadnought, Prefect Executor Sac Veyra stared at the catastrophic ruin of his divine empire. Driven by absolute venomous pride, he reached for the Master Console to trigger the Supreme Command override. He intended to manually detonate the Crown Furnace, determined to drag the human fleet and all the liberated worlds back into oblivion with him. But the command sequence was forcefully denied. Sac Veyra looked up from the console to find the heavy pulse rifles of his own elite royal guard pointed directly at his chest. The deeply indoctrinated soldiers of the Ascendancy finally understood the terminal reality of their situation. Their leader was not trying to win a war. He was trying to incinerate the very last shred of historical evidence that could ever allow their disgraced species to seek redemption. The Imperial Guard formally refused his final order, stripping him of his command in a silent, heavy mutiny. Tamsin Vale opened a direct, unencrypted channel to the bridge of the Kharad dreadnought. She looked directly at the deposed alien tyrant. She offered no grand political speech, no gloating mockery, and absolutely no promises of future forgiveness. "Your war is over," Tamsin stated, her voice possessing the cold, heavy finality of a closing tomb. "Not because your ship has run out of ammunition, but because the myth that allowed you to rule has died in front of the entire galaxy." Deep within the Kharad capital, the crown furnace collapsed inward upon itself, safely imploding its chaotic thermal energies without destroying a single piece of the damning evidence housed in the archive basilica. The fall of the Kharad Ascendancy was absolute. The ancient, parasitic empire rapidly shattered into dozens of small, heavily monitored defensive states. Under the crushing oversight of the newly united Galactic Coalition, these fragmented territories were forced to sign sweeping, unbreakable treaties. The weaponization of phase-locking technology was permanently outlawed. The concept of levy extraction wars was eradicated from the cosmos. And for the first time in recorded history, a massive interstellar tribunal was established specifically to prosecute crimes against reality itself. In the quiet months that followed, Meridian Wake began the agonizingly slow process of rebuilding. The colony would never truly be the same. The scars of their displacement were physically etched into the twisted metal of their transit lines and the strange, lingering temporal anomalies near the central plaza. But the scarred world stood as a permanent, undeniable monument to a new truth. Being stolen from the sky did not mean you were gone forever. Anchored silently in the freezing dark, forming a massive, protective ring around the recovering world, the vast human armada remained in position. The hundreds of thousands of warships did not hover above the colony like the menacing dreadnoughts of an occupying conqueror. They held their stations with quiet, absolute vigilance. They were the watchmen of the dark, a physical promise that humanity would never again allow the universe to slip quietly into the shadows. Down on the surface of the colony, the deep artificial twilight settled over a hastily repaired residential sector. The very first civilian street lamp suddenly flickered to life, casting a warm, amber glow against the cold metal walkways. A young child, bundled in a heavy thermal jacket, pointed a small, gloved finger up toward the night sky, where the massive, dark silhouettes of the human fleet eclipsed the distant stars. The child looked up at the weary, battle-scarred adult standing beside them and asked why all the big ships up there were always so quiet. The adult placed a gentle hand on the child's shoulder, looking up at the silent guardians, holding back the dark. Because what is truly dangerous is not anger. It is mercy strong enough to force the whole galaxy to change. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please let me know in the comments where you are listening from, so we can connect and share our thoughts. Do not forget to subscribe to the Sci-fi Stories channel, like the video, and support us even more by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by many more people.